What up, YouTube? Here with a post-fight video of the Chris Eubank Jr. versus Liam Smith. The second fight. Now, before I give y'all the summary of what happened in the fight, I'm going to tell y'all the results first. Chris Eubank Jr. was able to avenge his loss from the first fight via winning this fight in the 10th round via TKO stoppage. It was a dominant, one-sided performance by Chris Eubank Jr. I at this fight scored prior to the stoppage 9-0 in favor of Chris Eubank Jr. And arguably, I'll say this was one of his, if not the best performance in his pro career thus far. And this catapults Chris Eubank Jr. for a potential possible title shot to become a middleweight champion. And the middleweight division right now has a vacant slot because it is quite the opposite of it being lively. It is, I would say, quite dead because of the amount of competition that is lacking in the middleweight division as of right now. The scene at the middleweight division isn't talked about that much because of the best fighters at middleweight not being as notable when Triple G was in his prime, when Canelo, when Peter Quillin, Danny Jacobs, names like that were fighting at the top of the middleweight division. The middleweight division still hasn't gone through the resurgence that the division needs for it to be focused on by the boxing fans. And with Chris Eubank Jr. being a well-recognized household name amongst the top of the middleweights right now, especially out there in the UK, that helps him to potentially have a world title shot in his next fight. And especially coming off a brilliant performance like this one he pulled off versus Liam Smith in the rematch, this makes him a very strong candidate to become a world champion in the middleweight division. Now, he isn't ranked that high by any of the organizations in the middleweights right now. Y'all can go check out the rankings as far as all the title organizations and how they have their rankings set. And Chris Eubank Jr. is in the top 10 rankings amongst, I think, all the title organizations in the middleweight division. And the Ring magazine has him, I don't think he's even at the top 5 middleweights by Ring magazine. Now, after his performance, if they have updated it, they should have Chris Eubank Jr. amongst the top 5 middleweights. And if Chris Eubank Jr. fights any of the middleweight title lists for his next fight, if it's a European fighter, whether it be, I don't know the IBF middleweight champion's name. I don't know how to pronounce it correctly. His name is Vincenzo Gualtieri. He won the IBF middleweight title when it was vacated by the former IBF middleweight champion, Gennady Golovkin. He vacated the IBF and WBA middleweight titles to fight Canelo Alvarez for the 3rd time in his last fight, and that was competed as super middleweight, or I think it was at a catch weight. I don't know. However, it was above the weight limit at middleweight, which is the only weight class that Triple G has competed in. It was his first time fighting outside of the middleweight weight limit, and he vacated his WBA and IBF middleweight titles. And then this past July, Vincenzo Gualtieri, who is based out of Germany, who's had all his pro fights in Germany, won that vacant IBF middleweight title via defeating former undefeated, well-decorated amateur fighter, former silver medalist in the 2012 Olympic Games, Falcao, who is more experienced as a pro as well, and who was the favorite to win that fight. And Gualtieri won that fight via decision, and he's unbeaten, and he's not that well recognized amongst the boxing fans and the public, especially out here in the Western Hemisphere in the United States of America, because he's only fought in Germany and Europe. They tend to have more of a local domestic support when it comes to boxing fights, because whenever they have a title fight, it is considered major, and they have a good show of support when it comes to fans attending that fight. And you look at Usyk's fight versus Dubois, that was hosted in Poland. They had a good turnout event where a large amount of fans showed out for that fight. And it was the same for the Gualtieri-Falcao fight that was hosted in Germany, and that was for a world title. If y'all look at Klitschko's career, both Vitaly and Vladimir, they have majority of their fights, even though they're not from Germany, they have majority of their fights hosted in Germany at stadiums, and they always had a good amount of people show up for their fights, and they're not even based out of Germany. And you look at England, they have the healthiest boxing scene locally. Arguably, you could say it could be Mexico and Puerto Rico and Latin American countries that have the most local support when it comes to boxing fights. And America isn't even up there to be in the conversation with Mexico and England when it comes to the local boxing scene and the crowd and the fans and the public being enthusiastic about the sport of boxing. And as I said, if Chris Eubank Jr. does challenge and contend for the IBF middleweight title, which is held by a German fighter who's at all his fights in Germany, whether that fight be in England or Germany, is going to have a good turnout as far as the gate numbers go, because the fans in either countries are going to show up, because the promotions out there in Europe tend to put more of a effort into any fights, especially when it comes to title fights out there in Europe. And that would be a good look for Chris Eubank Jr. and also a good look for Gualtieri, because Gualtieri, as I said, even though he holds one of the titles amongst the middleweights right now, he is not a notable name when it comes to the boxing fans and the public. And that would help him get his notoriety and his name out there, because any champion deserves to get their name recognized by the public and the boxing fans if they're a champion at any weight class for that matter. And with Chris Eubank Jr. having the notoriety that he has, and him being a second generational talent, and his father having a history of being a well-recognized name, especially out there in the UK, helps him be more notable amongst not only the boxing fans, however, amongst the public. And that could help both fighters, Chris Eubank Jr., not for the notoriety's sake, but for him to potentially become a world champion, which he's been trying to accomplish in his pro career thus far. And he's worked a long time for it. And after a performance like this, I think definitely it would make him a strong candidate to contend for any of the middleweight titles right now. And Gualtieri, for him to get the recognition that he deserves. And after beating Falcao, he got notoriety, however, not the notoriety that a champion is used to having, or better yet, deserves. And I haven't seen Gualtieri fight ever. I gotta go see some of his fights and more clips of him, and that way I could get a better observation of the current IBF middleweight champion. And then there's Alim Kanali, who's 14-0, who's based out of Kazakhstan, who's had majority of his fights competed in America, and we're more used to seeing them on American networks, even though he's less experienced than all the other champions that is at middleweight and is less experienced than the top contenders at middleweight. However, he's got a decorated amateur career as well, and that's what makes him a champion in the middleweight division right now. He's a current WBO middleweight champion, and after Demetrius Andrade, who recently moved up to super middleweight, and for him to move up to super middleweight, he had to vacate his WBO middleweight title because Andrade, who's been putting in work for a very long time, undefeated, a very underrated fighter, is Demetrius Andrade. And he was WBO champion at super welterweight. He vacated that title to move up to middleweight and then won the WBO middleweight title, and he didn't get the fights that he wanted to get versus names like Canelo Alvarez, Triple G, Jermall Charlo, Danny Jacobs, names that draw, or even a Chris Eubank Jr. or a notable name that sells out over there in England, and he didn't get the fights that catapults his career to the next level. He wasn't getting the big money fights, hence why he stopped working with the Zone and got with PBC as he moved up to super middleweight. And once he vacated the WBO middleweight title, they had the interim WBO middleweight champion, who was Ali McAnally, become the new WBO middleweight champion. He could have a fight with Ali McAnally. I don't know how the promotional thing is going to work out. I'm sure Ali McAnally and his team won't mind traveling to England to have that fight versus Chris Eubank Jr., who's a draw out there. And then there is Jermall Charlo, who's been inactive for over 2 years now because he's going through personal problems and mental health problems. That's why he stated that he rejected the fight that was offered to him versus Canelo Alvarez once Canelo Alvarez's contract was up when working with the Zone. Now he is working with PBC, and it was first offered, this mega fight, to Jermall Charlo and not Jermell Charlo, who fights at super welterweight, and Jermall Charlo, who fights at middleweight, which is a division closer to super middleweight weight-wise than his twin brother, Jermell Charlo, who fights at super welterweight, and he's already the undisputed super welterweight champion and has fought much more tougher competition. And him being undisputed at super welterweight, I think the WBO had him vacate the super welterweight title for their organization because he didn't have that fight versus Tim Tszyu, who is the mandatory challenger next in line by the WBO to challenge for the WBO super welterweight title. Remember, they were supposed to fight earlier this year, and Jermell had to pull out of that originally scheduled date due to a hand injury that he suffered during his training camp. And instead of having that undisputed super welterweight fight versus undefeated prospect, another second generational talent, Tim Tszyu, for his next fight, and he took the fight that was offered first to his twin brother, the current WBC middleweight champion, Jermall Charlo, and he took that bigger money fight, the more notable fight versus Canelo Alvarez, which is coming up later this month for the undisputed super middleweight title. And if Jermall Charlo is turning down a mega fight versus the cash cow, arguably, I'm not even going to say arguably, definitely the most recognizable name in the sport of boxing, and it's been that way since Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao retire, and that is Saul Alvarez. If he's going to turn down that fight, then you know Jermall Charlo isn't in the best shape of his life. And it's quite odd to me that the WBC hasn't had Jermall Charlo vacate the WBC middleweight title when he hasn't defended it in over 2 years. And nobody knows when Jamal Charlo is going to compete in the ring again. And it's not a good look for not only a champion, I would say for any top level fighter to not fight in over a year, let alone 2 years. And that's why I'm quite surprised that the WBC has shown leniency to Jamal Charlo and still has him as their champion. And then there's Carlos Adames, who's been making noise amongst the middleweight division. He fights at PBC, and PBC has done a good job at promoting him and featuring Carlos Adames on their Showtime cards. He had an impressive performance versus Julian Williams in his last fight. That's the current WBC interim middleweight champion. And then the current WBA middleweight champion is veteran Erislandy Lara. And Erislandy Lara has had fights versus top-level opposition. He's fought Saul Alvarez. He's fought many notable names. And he is a very technical fighter who has a difficult style for any fighter to get in there against him. And he's got a well-decorated amateur career as well, much like many Cuban fighters. And even though he's fought in big stages before, he's not that much of a draw. He was supposed to fight Danny Garcia, who recently, in his last fight, made his debut at super welterweight and had an impressive performance in his debut fight at super welterweight. He was scheduled in August last month to fight Erislandy Lara for the WBA well, it's considered a super title. They don't have the world champion right now, so I'm just going to call it for the WBA middleweight title versus Erislandy Lara, and Danny Garcia being a draw, a household of a name, and he's been that for quite a while now, ever since he's been fighting at lightweight and super lightweight, and as well as at welterweight. And if he were to fight Erislandy Lara, that would have been a draw, with Erislandy Lara being a familiar name, especially amongst the boxing fans. And Erislandy Lara is definitely, I would say, the best fighter when it comes to fundamentals and technical skills, when it comes to overall boxing, out of all the champions in the middleweights right now. And Chris Eubank Jr., that would be the most difficult fight for him to become a middleweight champion, which I'm sure him and his team is looking forward for Chris Eubank Jr. to become a champion in the middleweight division. And as I said, the safest fight for him to become a champion at middleweight would be versus Gualtieri, even though he had a good performance versus Falcao in his last fight, which many people was expecting Falcao to win that fight. And Ali McConnelly, even though he has the least amount of professional experience, he is a good fighter as well, a championship level fighter. Regardless of the fact that the middleweight division doesn't have the competition like any other weight classes currently in the sport of boxing right now. And then Carlos Adames, who is a power puncher, and that would be a risky fight for Chris Eubank Jr. to take on. And promotionally, it would be easier for him to fight a European fighter than to fight a fighter, or better yet, a champion who fights in the United States of America. And then as far as his performance goes, I would say he picked up from where he left off at from the first fight. He didn't overcommit. He didn't get overzealous. He didn't leave any spots for him to get countered by Liam Smith in this fight. He was on it from the sound of the bell in the beginning of the fight all the way till he finished him in the 10th round via TKO. He had a great performance from start to finish, and he didn't leave any room or any opportunity for Liam Smith to get any offense or any counterattacks versus him in this fight. And Chris Eubank Jr. did a good job at applying the pressure versus Liam Smith. He placed his punches very well together. His combination flowed beautifully. His punches were accurate. His shots were effective, breaking through the guard and blocks of Liam Smith in this fight. And in this rematch, he made the right adjustments that he needed to make for him to be successful from the first fight that he had versus Liam Smith. And he didn't show any flaws fundamentally in this fight in the rematch versus Liam Smith. And his new trainer, Bout, who's the coach of Terrence Crawford, that adjustment in his corner really helped him out in this fight. I think their chemistry and their training camp went as successful as it did based on the performance that he had versus Liam Smith in the second fight. And he worked with Roy Jones Jr. for the first fight versus Liam Smith. And Roy Jones Jr. is a great mind and has a great amount of knowledge when it comes to the sport of boxing, as well as experience and success. However, Bout, he is a dedicated coach and a very sharp and a very great mind when it comes to the sport of boxing. And based on his performance, I think he should stick with Bout being his coach. And the way Chris Eubank Jr. performed in this fight, as I said, arguably the best performance in his career thus far. And his punches were on target, and his speed and his mobility and his fluidity and his movement was too much for Liam Smith to handle in this fight. Chris Eubank Jr. always had not only the hand speed superiority, however, the foot speed advantage as well, and it showed in this fight. Regardless of the fact that the commentary team did note that Liam Smith showed struggle when it came to dealing with his ankle in this fight. His corner as well talked about his ankle giving him trouble in this fight, hence why Liam Smith couldn't catch up to the ring generalship and the movement, and couldn't catch up with the pace and the rhythm of Chris Eubank Jr.'s offense and game plan in this fight. Unlike the first fight, he couldn't place himself in the right positioning and didn't have his balance and his footing under him to counterattack Chris Eubank Jr. and to neutralize Chris Eubank Jr.'s speed. And he couldn't time Chris Eubank Jr. And I don't want to take credit away from Chris Eubank Jr. because this was a great performance. And plus, I did not pay any attention to the post-fight follow-ups that happened after this fight. So I don't know what the problem was with Liam Smith and his ankle. I didn't hear anything about it. I didn't see anything about it. And I don't want to take anything away from Chris Eubank Jr.'s performance because this was a brilliant, great performance, a excellent fight fought by Chris Eubank Jr. And he looked tremendous. And Liam Smith, as I said, he struggled at getting anything going in this fight. As I said, I had this fight score 9-0, a shutout for Chris Eubank Jr. and him scoring a knockdown as well, him landing an uppercut. All his punches was the key to Chris Eubank Jr.'s victory in this fight because of how accurate and how flush and how effective and how crisp those shots were, and as well as Liam Smith not having any answers to the shots of Chris Eubank Jr. in this fight. And those punches and those shots accumulating great punishment on Liam Smith would catch up to him in the 10th round when Chris Eubank Jr. would go at him relentlessly with an onslaught of punches that would drop Liam Smith to the canvas yet again. Liam Smith answered the referee's count, and Liam Smith, he wasn't very much hurt. It looked like he could have continued, but because of the fight being not competitive and it being so one-sided that the referee had seen enough, and Liam Smith and his corner argued that he could have continued, which I'm quite sure that Liam Smith could have continued fighting. However, I, along with many other fans, didn't see any problems with the referee calling a halt to the bout after Chris Eubank Jr. took full advantage after yet another knockdown that happened in the 10th round, and he kept coming at him with punches and bunches, and then the referee stepped in to stop the fight because Liam Smith wasn't landing anything. He wasn't throwing much, however, but because he wasn't landing anything and it being not competitive, that's what had set the referee to say enough is enough. And I thought it was a right call. And as I said, the middleweight division right now doesn't have any, well, not any, I would say doesn't have much eyes being attentive to their scene right now because of the amount of competition and it being not lively. And the lighter weight classes that doesn't get any attention paid forward to them is getting more of a light shunned on them, and they very much deserve that, because if y'all looking for fan-friendly style fights, then look no further than the lighter weight classes. They don't get enough attention at those weight classes because to the public and regular sports fans who don't tap into the sport of boxing as much as dedicated boxing fans and long-time boxing fans, because to the average carnal mind, they like to see the physical specimens go at it and slug it out rather than the smaller, more agile, more durable fighters. And that's how it's always been when it comes to the majority of the public. And the middleweight division, this is how you know the competition is lackluster amongst the middleweights. They have former middleweight champions who retired years ago, who moved on to promoting as a boxing promoter out there in Spain. Former middleweight champion, 40-plus-year-old fighter from Argentina who is based out of Spain now. And he dealt with great amounts of injuries even before his pro boxing career as a soccer player and as a cyclist. Sergio Maravilla Martinez, who had a good run as the middleweight champion. He's currently ranked at number 4 by the WBC in the middleweight division right now. A formerly retired middleweight champion who is over the age of 40, who's approaching his 50s, is ranked above the top 5 middleweights by the WBC. The WBC has always been criticized by the boxing fans for their corruptness and for their favoritism. And with the WBC not having Jamal Charlo, who hasn't defended that belt in over 2 years, and him still being champion, and Sergio Martinez being ranked amongst the top 5 contenders in the middleweights right now, just adds to that theory and is not a good look for not only the WBC, however, I'll say for the middleweight division right now. Anyways, with that being said, that does it for this post-fight video. Y'all let me know what y'all opinions are from this fight that y'all saw. What would y'all like to see next for the future of Chris Eubank Jr.? As I said, I noted many names, along with the champions in the middleweight division that he could fight right now. I don't think Triple G, that fight, is going to be next or going to be anywhere in the future for Chris Eubank Jr. because, honestly, I think Triple G has done enough in his pro career, and he's got a well-decorated amateur career as well, and he's over the age of 40 years old now, and he showed that he's not the same fighter that he once was when he was in his prime, and he was this monster of a power puncher who walked through anything. He's still durable. He still walks through shots like it's nothing. However, he's not at the tip-top shape of his career, and he's not the same fighter that we are used to seeing him as. And I think it's appropriate that Triple G retires, and he had that cash-out fight versus Saul Alvarez in his last fight, and I think that was a proper way for Triple G to exit out of the sport. It would be a big money fight for Chris Eubank Jr., and it would be even more impressive if Chris Eubank Jr. can get a win over a legend like Triple G. However, I think Triple G is going to retire, hence why I don't see that fight happening for Chris Eubank Jr. in the future. Anyways, I thought I'd get that thought out of the way. Subscribe, share, like, all that good stuff. And I'm out of here, y'all. Click the links in the description to show y'all support. Anything would be very much appreciated. And peace.